We've just had the afternoon session. Oh, hang on. Is this starting or not? This bloody thing's not. Yeah, so we just had the afternoon session of day one of Tranche 2, Phase 2 of the Undercover Policing Inquiry. Mostly much more bearable than this morning because we've been hearing from lawyers for non-state, non-police co-participants, which means that our side, for want of a better word, has been given evidence. Yeah, which is a lot better. It was started off. We started off with Neil Shelton representing the Home Office, which you know I'll leave that behind. Quite frankly, I didn't feel any particular. There was nothing particularly. I mean, actually, the one thing that was really noticeable what he said was that despite the fact that the Home Office are co-participants, they're also the people who set up the inquiry, financed the inquiry. Yeah, you know. Um, so there's that element to their role, but they still they still complained that the inquiry hadn't disclosed the information for this set of hearings to them in a good time, so they haven't read it yet. Which I mean is literally the same thing that the rest of us have been saying. Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, beyond that, I don't think there was anything. They claimed the Home Secretary is appalled by the actions of the undercover police officers, and it's vital they get to the truth. Um, he talked about how the legislation had changed, about how they brought in the CHIS Act now, the Covert Human Intelligence Sources Criminal Conduct Act, which is fucking awful. I mean, it's a fucking awful piece of legislation which basically legalises murder and rape. So, I mean, I don't know why they did bring that up as if things had improved. He claimed that the Home Office only had limited knowledge of the SDS, which is absolute bollocks. Yeah. And yeah, there was the thing about like, remember that the government is made up of many departments, of which the Home Office is only one. So Home Office can't be used as a shorthand for government. They definitely didn't know about dead children's identities being used. Definitely didn't know about sexual relationships, and definitely didn't know about the criminal activity or perjury. Yeah, and they really wanted to distance themselves from Trevor Morris. No surprise. Then we got on to the non-police, non-state co-participant lawyers, starting off with Quincy Whitaker, representing John Burke Moliville. She was really badly misgendered by John Mitting, which was a terrible start to from him again, as usual. The story of the Moliville family is so incredibly distressing. John Burke Moliville has had three sons who were all murdered. The whole story is just so horrific. Following the murder of, following the extreme beating up of Ronald Monaville by the police on New Year's Day, the family was constantly harassed by the police. His then 79-year-old father and 73-year-old mother, so Roland's grandparents, were subject to harassment. The 73-year-old mother was prosecuted for assaulting a police officer. What the fuck? But she was acquitted for that. She was awarded damages for the way they treated her. John Burke Monaville, it was a lovely bloke. I sit next to him in the inquiry quite often. Often he's, given the huge levels of trauma he's experienced in his life, the way in which he manages to carry himself with such dignity and good humour is an inspiration to all of us. And I am constantly humbled by the way in which he carries himself. He totally rejects the idea that black justice groups, including the Trevor Monaville campaign, were spied on as merely collateral intrusion, which is fucking offensive. He talked about there was a great deal of evidence given about how in which the Monaville family were infiltrated by undercover police. Mark Cassidy, turned up to their events. They talked about how the police liaison officer who was coming around their house didn't seem to be helping the family at all or helping with the investigation into the murders of his other sons, but simply wanted to know information about what the campaign was doing. Disgusting, just purely disgusting. I mean, the justification for infiltrating the family was public disorder, but yet the only reference to public disorder in any of the reports was that it was unlikely. Her audio was really bad. I don't know whose fault that was. I don't know if it was the inquiry's fault or what, but it was very difficult to follow. So apologies, I didn't take as many notes as I normally do. The Monnevilles urged the chair to recognise racism as a motivation for some of the reporting and deployments, and that has to be the heart of the investigation by the inquiry when it comes to black justice campaigns. And the idea that the police really saw any group that was asking for more accountability for police misconduct as being anti-police. This is literally how they characterised anybody who was trying to hold the police to account. And it's disgusting. I mean, like we heard quite a lot about that today in different sort of settings. Pointing out the police could have used their resources to investigate the corruption, racism, and misconduct that the Black Justice campaigns, including the Trevor Monneville campaign, were highlighting, but instead they spied on them. There was a lot of references to police officers using racial slurs, which I'm not going to repeat. Making the point that like no one else does this, no other organisation casually and automatically allows the use of such well-known racial slurs. I mean, the use of the N-word and other somewhat more historical terms which have similar meanings being used quite casually. Disgusting. Then we had Rajiv Menon on behalf of Richard, Nathan and Aubrey Adams. He talked about how racism was really characterised British policing for the last 50 plus years. Talked about the what we call the imperial boomerang, how so many colonial police officers had gone into the Met Police, particularly after the Second World War. How these are paramilitary policing, which very militarised, very very brutal, completely unaccountable, incredibly racist throughout the British Empire. And that really this sort of form of colonial policing had come back to the UK, particularly when it came to the policing of ethnic minorities. I think he makes a fantastic point. I think anybody who is familiar with the history of policing and the history of colonial policing would agree entirely with what he surmises as being the sort of the link there. It points out that the racist murder of Roland Adams and the attack on Nathan Adams in February 91 and the subsequent spying on the family was an ideal example of the impact of racism had on the way the deployments took place, and the failure really of the Met Police to do anything about far right and racist criminal gangs, which were running rampant. Particularly in that part of London during that time. A really upsetting story about the way in which Roland was murdered and Nathan was racially attacked. About how the people who did it, only one of them was charged. The police said it wasn't racist. The judge disagreed. I mean, given the way the police are always using joint enterprise to prosecute as many members of any sort of gang as possible, when it comes to racist gangs, they weren't doing that. And so why is that? Why do you think that might be? And it's because there's this racist stereotype that black boys can never be innocent. Just disgusting. Really disturbing. Again, that there's this thing that if the police had acted at the time in a way in which was consistent with the concept of justice and everybody being equal in front of the law, then maybe wouldn't have had so many racist murders after that. Maybe lots of other people would have lives have been saved, but the police weren't interested in that. They were interested in spying on a law-abiding family who wanted justice for their murdered son. It pointed out that the focusing as the inquiry is on the SDS, it's only a small, tiny part of the undercover and policing that Special Branch was doing at the time. And the terms of reference include much more than the inquiry is willing to look at, just because it's too much work. I mean, that's what they keep saying, is that it's too much work for them, they can't be bothered. And essentially, they haven't got the ability to do it, supposedly. The inquiry is it's become a much as into an investigation into the lives of those who were spied on as an investigation of the activities of the undercover police who did the spying. I mean, it's like this, this ridiculous thing we heard from Oliver Saunders this morning about how like there was two tiers. I mean, there isn't two tiers, but there fucking should be. Um, there's a reason why the inquiry is taking place, and it's not because people campaign for justice. The reason there's an inquiry taking place is that undercover police officers infiltrate people's lives. Um, yeah. Weirdly, John Mitting replied to Rajiv Menon. He has a tendency to do this to Rajiv, but no one else. It's really odd. He says that the right-wing groups were infiltrated from the 80s onwards, so they weren't infiltrated in the 70s. I mean, we've covered that in a lot of detail in previous coverage of the inquiry, that there was, during the high point of the National Front and the racist violence that came from that, the police didn't consider that to be a problem because they agreed with the National Front. In the 80s, supposedly there is infiltration of undercover officers. Certainly anybody who's seen the True Lives documentary knows that that's been talked about quite openly. Yet, John Mitting says that for reasons that should be obvious, the inquiry won't be hearing any of the infiltration of the far right in public. I mean, what he's inferring there, I think, for the reasons that should be obvious, which is a great excuse I'm going to use all the time. Why were you late? Well, for reasons that should be obvious. Is that somehow the far right is uniquely threatening to the former undercover officers. Yet why were they talked about so openly in the True Spies documentary 20 years ago? It's a nonsense. It's an utter nonsense. And it is simply that the former undercover police officers have managed to pull the wool over the eyes of the chair of the inquiry when it comes to fears they claim that they have. There's no danger of former undercover police. I mean, if there was any danger of former undercover police officers being attacked by people that they had infiltrated, then Neil Woods, who infiltrated a huge number of criminal gangs, who were much, much more violent than any of the political groups that we've been talking about, wouldn't have been able to talk so openly about it, walk around under his real name, with his real face, appearing on TV, appearing in public. The idea that he was able to do that, yet these officers were infiltrated far-right groups which fell apart a long time ago, is just utter bullshit and should be treated with the contempt. John Mitting is just showing his absurd naivety by holding those things in private. It's pathetic. He shows his own lack of intelligence and insults our intelligence by coming out with things that, like, for reasons that I hope are obvious. I mean, it's just like, for fuck's sake. Then we had Charlotte Kilroy giving the opening statement on behalf of Category H core participants. Category H is the women who were deceived into sexual relationships with undercover officers. Well, it's mostly them. It's also me, but I'm not one of those. But anyway, I'm in the group. But I don't actually take part in drafting the opening statements or anything because I don't feel it's my place. She went through, she pointed out there were 17 women known to have been abused by undercover police officers during the 10 years that this tranche is relating to. And the real number is much, much higher. She talked about Bob Lambert's 4 sexual relationships and his fathering of 1 child. We talk about how his love bombing of Belinda Harvey, who wasn't an activist, but because he was claiming to be an activist, she really changed her life because of his opinions. Like, he stopped her, like she stopped trying to become an accountant because he was an anti-capitalist, and she didn't get a job. She didn't buy a flat above a chicken shop because he was an animal rights activist. Yeah, and he really love bombed her, professing some really heavy duty love for it, which is something we see again and again from these officers. She was terribly traumatized by his sudden disappearance. She kept hoping that he would return or send for her or something. Devastated her when she found out he was an undercover police officer. It really seems like he used her personal life as a fantasy play world that he could use for his personal desires. This is something we see a few times, I think. Charlotte Kilroy really effectively painted a picture of the way in which the undercover officers, it was not just about their job, it was also them getting their jollies, for want of a better word. Talked about how the senior officers knew that Bob Lambert had fathered a child, that he was having so many relationships. Talked as well about the age differences. Like John Dines was 32 when he targeted the 22-year-old Helen Steele. He told her he loved her, but he really was using it and get great cover for his false identity. But he bombarded her with love letters and really manipulated her to fall in love with him, which she was quite resistant to at first. He had to really kind of really work on that, and he's kind of proud of the way that he did that. I mean, he's boasted about it in his witness statement. He said he had to make Helen Steele fall in love with him, even though personally he didn't give her rats. I presume that didn't give a rat's ass about her in any way. It's the way in which he withdrew was equally manipulative, claiming to have mental health problems, which made her very worried about him. Even in the context of the horrific pieces of shit that so many of the undercover police officers are, you get the impression that John Dines is a particularly odious scumbag. Horrific behaviour then and now. He's really, his witness statement's full of really cruel and vile comments about Helen, which are blatantly designed just to hurt her feelings. He's really proud of using her body in this way, both for his own personal pleasure and for his job. Odious. He's also a coward. He's refusing to come back to the UK. He works in Australia, where he teaches ethics to the Australian police. Yeah, exactly. It's just really disgusting. If you read the disclosure, if you read that witness statement, I challenge you not to develop a true hatred for John Dines. Then we went on to HM1, who used the name Matt Rayner, who claims he was actively encouraged to build relationships. So he targeted Denise Fuller for a sexual relationship of over a year. She had health problems. He presented himself as a caring partner and really targeted her when she was at her weakest. When she was having a particularly hard time, he went to her, and that's when they started their relationship. But he filed reports from that, and the heavy sarcasm in it reveals he didn't give a fuck about her. He really didn't give a fuck about her. He was just using her. Again, it's just the cruelty, the real cruelty. And the fact that he's managed to be able to keep his real name secret in all of this, the inquiry's not letting her know his real name. It's disgusting. Shows John Mitton cares more about the privacy of a sexual abuser than he does about the victims. It's appalling. Then talked about Andy Coles, who at age 32 targeted Jessica, age 19. She'd never had a boyfriend. The relationship lasted a year and was mostly for extramarital sex for Coles. He was, a married man. When she went to work abroad in France, he wrote to her saying he should be allowed to have sex with other people because he wasn't getting any sex with her out of the country. He could have sex with his wife as well. He denies the relationship completely, which is disgusting. Everybody else accepts it happened. Everybody was there. Other police officers, the Met Police themselves. Another odious piece of shit. Every time you think like this is the worst one, you kind of look at the others and go, "Oh God, he's just as bad as well." They're all really, really awful, awful people. The point out how much he lied. It's things he's lied about to the inquiry, and so many of the officers have lied about the inquiry, which we know to be false. These are provable, factual matters, not just, like kind of he said, she said stuff. We talked about the 35-year-old Trevor Morris, who came, they all knocked 5 years off. He claimed to be 30. He justified the two sexual relationships we heard in the last set of hearings, B and Jenny, as he needed them for his alter ego. And got very, very, very upset about the apology that had been made, slagging off the apology being made. Managers were fully aware of all this. Women were seen as disposable, and the sex relationship was seen as perks of the job. There was a lot of talk about the police culture of backing each other up. So they only name officers who are dead, or very admitted their relationships, or somebody damaged goods. So Peter Francis, because he's gone whistleblower, he gets slagged off by the officers, or Mike Chitty because he was chucked out of the unit, or chucked out of the police for medical grounds, and you know. So it's like they don't, you know, they don't want to. They don't want a situation where they're blaming each other. I mean, this is, you know, if you ever want to, it's long been said, if you ever want to see true solidarity in action, watch the way in which police officers who've broken the law back each other up. We were given a lot of quotes by back officers, largely to Operation Hearn, where they were very open about the fact that, yeah, sexual, you know, there were relationships formed within the group, and sexual relations followed. And then how they like pathetically try and pretend that that's not what they meant at the time. I mean, we've seen it a few times already, but you know, there's some really like extreme ones coming up. You know, yeah. So DCI McLeod, DCI Docker, at HM109 referred he was questioned about Operation Sparkler, and he said that high standards of intelligence were gained from horizontal politics. So then when she now goes, oh no, I didn't mean sex. It's like, what the fuck else do you mean then, you stupid piece of shit? Yeah, DCI Hind, claiming that it was a different ball game to sexual relationships because the undercover officer was attracted to the individual as opposed for operational reasons. Then something else he kind of pushed away. There was a lot of that. So like, the commissioner accepts that at least 9 undercover officers had sexual relationships with women during this period. It's taken until 2024 for them to recognise that and offer an apology, seeing they knew. I mean, Charlie Kilroy developed this other point, which I think is really, really good and really important, and I think like kind of goes to the heart of a large part of the problem of the whole thing. It wasn't just that the undercover officers were misogynistic and sexist. Is that they felt themselves liberated from a wide range of ordinary moral rules and restraints which would normally govern their conduct. So they could play with the lives of those they had their sexual relationships with. They could like toy with their feelings and wield a power over them, and with incredible levels of cruelty. You know, manipulating and grooming their victims to secure like a deep love for them, which they purely did to enhance their cover, obtain intelligence, but also for like just the pleasure of the sex and the emotional manipulation. It's something which really deeply goes to the heart of. I mean, it's not just the undercover police, is it? Really, it's the deeply it's something really dark about men in general and the society in which we live and the way in which men in positions of power use that over women's bodies, and this is just the most extreme example of it, or one of the most extreme examples of it. We see it with coercive control. We see it in so many ways, and it's so disturbing, and it's so upsetting, and you can recognise elements of it in different parts of life, and it's just so fucking horrible, man. It's so rage-inducing, but like, yeah. You know, the undercover deployment sort of like released these men from their moral constraints, which like, you know, people where they live and their families kind of like stop them from doing, and it, you know, there's this really dark behaviour where there's no consequences to their actions. Which I think kind of gives the thing about like, we've seen a lot of justification for the deployment, saying, oh well, this thing was bad or that thing was bad, but overall these sorts of deployments were, you know, worthwhile and useful and good. And it's like, no, you can't. They're too intrusive and too dangerous. You can't ever justify this kind of deployment. I don't care what the fuck it's for. It doesn't. It's too much, you know. To point out that loads of the undercover officers are not being honest when they're giving evidence. We've just seen that time and again. Just the contradictions. They're too many. They haven't got any remorse. They have no empathy for their victims. They're covering for each other constantly. Talked about the role of MI5, how much, you know, how much they were behind all of it, about how like the cops really fantasized about themselves, think of themselves James Bond, you know, and like, you know, they could be fast and loose with women because that's what James Bond did, and I mean, like, fucking hell, man, James fucking Bond is fucking load of fucking sexist shit. He's a fucking rapist, and like I've long found the way in which he's held as being something cool as being deeply disturbing. But like, I mean, okay, that exists in fiction, but when people try to live it out in their real lives and they have like, there's no consequences for their actions, they can do what the fuck they like. It manifests itself in this kind of stuff, and it's disgusting. And there's this sort of like a fun way that which like you see in the media, and we saw it from the chair, particularly early on, of like invoking Bond as like kind of like, oh, there's like Bond. I mean, they all keep talking about him. Trevor Morris said he was the Black James Bond. Fucking they all keep talking, like it's been brought up numerous times. It's disgusting. It's also talked about the trauma of taking part in the inquiry. I mean, this is something I'm very aware of from the women who were taking part, Police Spies Out of Lives and others who. It's incredibly traumatic, and it was always going to be traumatic. Like reading what they had to say, responding to it, and then like seeing them on the stand and shit. But it's been made much worse by the way in which the inquiry has behaved, and like how late disclosure has been made, and then like putting massive pressure on to produce the responses in really short time frames. It was fucking obscene, really fucking obscene. It was really powerfully delivered by Charlotte Kilroy. She's excellent. I mean, it was written by lots of people, obviously, so it's not just her, but yeah, very powerful. Then lastly, we had James Scobie representing Michael Chant, Lindsay German, CND. He's the barrister representing the Public Interest Law Centre clients, which is basically like kind of the left, the traditional left, I guess, left-wing groups, SWP, SP, those kind of people. I'll be honest, it was a long day. As you can see now, I'm sort of pretty wiped out, but so I didn't take as many notes as I normally do. Though looking back, actually, it appears I've got loads. But yeah. God, there was a lot more about. There was a lot more that Charlotte said. Yeah. The infiltration of CND, despite the fact that they were not subversive, was highlighted repeatedly. Talked about how the witness why this new disclosure of information from the security services, how that contradicts so many things we've heard before. Talk about how the security services knew full well that anything in the nature of the Gestapo would have been unacceptable to the British public was said by senior members of the government in the early 60s. The British state knew full well that it wasn't acceptable. We heard the bullshit like lines of justification from these managers about infiltrating CND, the nonsense about it being to do with civil disobedience, which was rejected by other senior police officers at the time. The potential for subversion, which was something that anybody's got potential for subversion. It's like, I've got the potential for space travel as well, but I don't, for fuck's sake. Talked about the spying on the Greater London Council's police committee with its accountability on the Met campaign. And using undercover officers to do that, which is directly like challenging like a democratically elected body. They did this infiltration despite being told by the Home Office they couldn't do it, saying they wouldn't do it, and they did it anyway. This whole like sort of implausible public order justification for it, which was ridiculous. Talked about how the Ministry of Defence's DS-19 propaganda unit launched an operation against CND. MI5 like told DS-19 about 7 senior members of CND who they claimed were communists. HN65 claimed that 27 of them were, and then the press Talked about 28 of them. So where was the information coming from? Was it coming from the Military Defence Unit? Was it coming from the Special Demonstration Squad? You know, bit of both, but mostly Special Demonstration Squad. I pointed out that it's not just about the Home Office, it's also the engagement between the Met Police, the Ministry of Defence, the Cabinet Office and the Prime Minister's Office, and the inquiry needs to look at that. I won't be holding my breath on that. I talked about how CND was a mass democratic movement of ordinary people, and that scares the government because it's always scared of mass movements and it's scared of democracy itself, which I think goes to the heart of it. Yeah, there's loads of things that were said today which I haven't covered. I realise that it's half an hour I've been talking now. Jesus fucking Christ. Right, I'm going to end this video. I'm going to do a Twitter Spaces later on. If you're around, if you've listened this far of this video, then you should really join me on that. Open to anybody who's been following today. Yeah, at 7 o'clock on Twitter. Cheers.